Increasingly, development agencies are using tourism as a means of poverty alleviation. However, all too often, they seem to overlook the economic, environmental, and social impacts of their interventions. But surely, I hear you say, aren't they doing this already? Well, the answer is that almost all talk the sustainability talk, but very few walk it in an impactful way. I'm going to present 3 very simple solutions. But first, let me start by giving you some context of the role of tourism in the developing world as a tool for poverty alleviation. Despite the focus of development agencies and the government on pro-poor growth over the last 20 years, poverty remains one of the world's greatest challenges. In 2013, almost 1 billion people, that's 12.7% of the global population, continue to live below the poverty line. Tourism is one of the world's fastest growing industries, and it has the ability to contribute directly or indirectly to all of the sustainable development goals. It represents one of the top 5 sectors for 83% of developing countries, and for many, it ranks as their first. Since the 1990s, development agencies have been increasingly investing in tourism as a tool for pro-poor economic growth, bringing in much needed foreign investment, foreign currency. However, the quest for short-term economic growth often leads to significant negative impacts on environmental, social, and economic systems. For example, poor communities have been known to lose a lot of their water supply as the demand for hotels takes priority. Locals have been forced to leave their villages because the cost of living has become too high. Gentrification for the purpose of tourism has forced land price inflation and forced them out. And cultural norms have been severely disrupted by inappropriate behavior of tourists. Whilst development agencies have had some success in reducing poverty, the overall impact has been seriously compromised by their inefficient attention to sustainability issues. So why is it that sustainability has not been embedded by development agencies? There are 5 key reasons, and the first is an insufficient understanding of sustainability. For development agencies, sustainability tends to mean the ability of the program's activities to continue once the funding has finished. It's not about the wider economic, social, and environmental impacts. The second reason, sustainability is not integrated into the planning and investment phases and decisions. The lack of knowledge means that it's often not prioritized, and it's often brought in year 2 or 3 of a program. It's not actually brought in the design and investment scenario decision stages. It's usually considered a cross-cutting issue like gender, which means that development agencies tend to have some sustainable tourism activities, but it's not embedded into the DNA of their programs. The third reason, many development programs have too narrow a focus on increasing the incomes of the poor. Hey, I hear you say, why is that a problem? Well, they tend to ignore the potential negative environmental and social impacts of their programs on the poor. The fourth, timescale. Development programs themselves are too short. 2 to 3 years is just too short a period to be able to realize any impactful results. The Aga Khan Development Network is one of the few development agencies that takes a 10-year or more view on their tourism programs, reaping excellent results in some of the world's most challenging developing countries. And the fifth and final reason, development agencies often don't collaborate with a sufficiently broad set of stakeholders, and they don't look beyond traditional development models. For example, they tend to overlook the potential of the private sector as a multiplier of the impact of their investment. The solution. So what is needed? Just 3 key, very simple actions. First, ensuring the economic, environmental, and social impacts are embedded throughout all stages of the program and are given equal weighting. And this isn't just about the program's activities, but it's also the wider impacts on the destination's sustainability. Just like businesses need to integrate sustainability into their business model, so too do development agencies. Second, working on longer timeframes. Yes, it's more of a challenge. However, development agencies have to tackle their own internal barriers and take on board years and years of persistent lessons learned from around the world that actually short-term interventions are very seldom effective. And thirdly, simply building the capacity on how to genuinely implement sustainability, not only for the beneficiaries or the program implementing partners, but also for the development agency staff themselves. So, if these 3 very simple things were embedded, not only would development agencies actually have a better chance of achieving their overall goal of poverty reduction, but they'd have a better chance of ensuring that destinations were more sustainable. And of course, all this can only be good for tourism businesses. For me, it's a no-brainer. So I invite all development professionals working on tourism programs to start implementing these very 3 simple solutions.
Are there any questions? Libby, you told us how it can happen. Can you tell us where it's happening?
Sure. I think there are some development agencies that are actually implementing this, and most of those are using a new model which is called market M4P, or a market systems development approach, which is taking a systemic approach to development. It's a shift away from traditional development models. It's about engaging the private sector and making sure that these partnerships with the private sector can be leveraged and leverage their own investment. It's happening in places like in Laos and Cambodia. Swiss Contact is an excellent agency who are implementing sustainability right from the planning and investment phases and partnering with the private sector as well. There are quite a few other destinations, but certainly Swiss Contact, you'll hear very shortly that GIZ are also partnering with the private sector and taking a different approach with Explore.
And specifically looking at the private sector, you didn't mention, but one of the problems is that the amount of money invested can be very high, but then leakage of an awful lot of the money going back out again without actually reaching the men and women it needs to get to. We're seeing this week with the publication of the Paradise Papers, and it's picking up on the Panama Papers, that there's an awful lot of complex tax avoidance going on that means that in the private sector, money that's supposed to reach where it's originally destined to simply doesn't get there. How can development agencies ensure they're not facilitating that?
I think it's all about due diligence, and these days development agencies are becoming having to be much more accountable back to their donors and actually to taxpayers on where their money is actually going and the impacts they're having. So it really is about due diligence right from the very beginning in terms of planning and design phases.
Thank you.
I've got a question before we go back. Yeah. So you've been speaking of development and tourism, and you're talking of development agencies. Surely in tourism, it's not the development agency that's supposed to be delivering the development, but rather the service provider on the ground that the client is going to.
No, absolutely. And these new models of development shift development agencies away from being the implementers and actually taking a role in the tourism market, shifting them away, and they simply become facilitators. So whilst I completely agree with your statement, my subject is actually on development agencies, and they have a role to play because they are investing in tourism development programs, and their role is now much more about facilitation rather than actually becoming an actor in the tourism sector and fulfilling the role of other private sector people, the role that perhaps either the government or the private sector should be playing. There's a shift away from that.
Sure, okay, I get that. So we're in tourism here, so how do we get on to the development agencies' agenda to take our agenda?
Well, I think you'll see a lot more development agencies attending some of these sessions here over the next few days. And development agencies are becoming a lot more aware about the whole sustainable tourism movement, responsible tourism movement. In terms of how do you find out where these programs are, and are they in countries where perhaps your business is operating? Maybe we can have a chat after this, and I can kind of tell you where some of the key investments are by development agencies.
Yeah, please do, that's of interest. I say that because we're in tourism, like everybody else here, but we're a provider in Africa. And the only reason that we're on the ground in Africa is to help development. So we're looking for people who want to invest in development, but we're not a development agency.
Yeah, and that's why that's a perfect example of where bringing the two together can have a fantastic impact compared to individual businesses and individual development agencies working separately.
Thank you.
Hi, Libby.
Hello.
I'm Peter Richards, and I work a lot in Southeast Asia, also on sustainable tourism, responsible tourism, community-based tourism projects. It was really interesting. I agree with lots of the things that you've said. One thing I think, working on the ground, if our managers who are often based in Europe, for example, if they're open and they're listening to what we're saying, and from the ground up, especially when situations change. I mean, we write plans sometimes 2 or 3 years in advance, but then there's the real dynamic situation, and having to be flexible and this kind of thing. So I think one thing is helping the bosses, to have ways of being open and listening to feedback coming up from the ground. I think as you get a bit older, you have a few more air miles, it gets a bit easier to kind of manage up the chain. But when you're new, it's quite daunting. So that's my feedback on that. Thank you.
I think flexibility is absolutely key, particularly in development programs. As you say, the situation on the ground is completely changing, and what you set out to do, 3 years before, actually two years in can be very different.